Were you the last lead investigator of the Mullendore murder case?
I guess you could say that.
What's the status on that case?
Well, whenever I was still at the sheriff's office, Chubb Anderson had just resurfaced. He disappeared for a long time, and he resurfaced actually working for Ted Turner in Montana. And whenever he took on a whole new identity, he was living as Jack Everett, and he would have died as Jack Everett if this would have happened. I firmly believe, but he started having some medical issues and was having to be put on dialysis, and he was in the hospital, and he gives the Jack Everett name and social security number, and it comes back, Jack died many years ago. So that was the red flag that got him caught. And he wouldn't, confess to who he was. They come in, fingerprint him, and bam, he's wanted. He's in Kansas' top 10 most wanted at one point for cultivation of marijuana. At that point, he had never been charged in Oklahoma for the Mullendore murder. He was always a suspect, but had never been charged.
Was he ever charged for it?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
What is the Mullendore murder case for people that's not aware of it?
E.C. Mullendore in September of 1970 was a rich landowner, cattle baron, if you will, mover and a shaker for his times, for sure. Lived on a ranch in northeastern Oklahoma and southern Kansas, and it was a family-owned ranch, and he was running it, and he was murdered one night. And it was rough times, a lot of stuff going on. The story's very thick when you really...
Yeah, they were having financial trouble.
A lot of books written about it.
Yeah, major financial issues. But a lot of that was, I was always told, EC was trying his best. He had dozers running around the clock, clearing country, and
building fence,
and building these ranch houses where they were feasible to live in, because it was rumored his father wasn't as caring, so. Gene was his father, what his dad went by, but he was E.C. Mullendore also. But so he got himself into a financial pickle, and at that time started bringing some shady characters around, trying to find money and trying to find ways to make money, and ultimately at the end of the day, E.C.'s death saved the ranch. Realistically, if you want to really look at it. The facts. He had a $15 million life insurance policy on him, which was the largest to that date ever in America. When they computed that, when they couldn't compute that big of a figure, so they had to do 3 $5 million life insurance policies. And so there was a lot that went on in that situation. But EC or Chubb had been arrested in Montana and extradited back to Kansas, or was in the extradition process whenever retired Sheriff George Wayman contacted the current sheriff at that point, Ty Cook, and said, "Hey, Chubb's arrested. I want to go talk to him." So at that point, myself and another investigator, Dwight Barnard, just basically went with Chubb, or with Sheriff Wayman, to meet Chubb and let him talk, because Sheriff Wayman he always said that Chubb told him that if he ever found him on his deathbed, he'd tell him what happened that night. So he was hoping he was close enough into his deathbed, if you will, that he would talk. So that's how I got involved.
But he never did really admit anything to Wayman, did he?
No. He respected Wayman, I think, as a professional, but he didn't like Wayman. I mean, he cussed Wayman. I've heard that many times, which he didn't respect law enforcement.
Right,
I mean, he's an outlaw, you know.
Sure.
But he respected him. I mean, I interviewed or was with Chubb, I think, 3 different times when we interviewed him, and he was always very respectful and always, nice guy, but he was the character that he's portrayed. I will say that.
Yeah. I can't believe they haven't made a movie out of that. There were so many different facets to that story, like Bart said, and that would make a great movie.
And there's so much I discovered through that. And I keep in mind, I was born in 1977. This happened in 1970. So Chubb always kind of got a little kick out of that I was up there working on this. I wasn't even born when it happened. But what's funny is when I was born, my dad worked for L&B Land and Cattle, and they leased the Mullendore. And we lived up there northwest of Dewey when I was born, and so I always thought that was kind of interesting because I always had a little bit of a love affair, if you will, of the Mullendore, and you know, it was a very iconic location and ranch and beautiful place, and a monster, you know, in its time.
It was the largest singly owned ranch. I mean, it was him and his dad, but I think it was the largest singly owned ranch in Oklahoma at that time. You had the Little Chief Ranch, Sedan, Blue Stem out there by the spillway, and then the one up there at the headquarters. You know, it was a large operation.
Your Uncle Joe, he worked out there.
Uncle Joe was working for him when EC got killed. And I'll never forget the phone call. You know, I was just a big kid in 70, but I remember the phone call. I think it was maybe a Sunday morning. Got the call that EC had been killed. I remember it like yesterday.
Well, in Osage County in 1970, for a rancher to get killed, period, is news.
Yeah, sure.
But for the Mullendore ranch owner, you know, to get killed, it's monstrous. I mean, that was one thing that I discovered through this process, I guess, somewhat of the blame the sheriff's office received. And I'm, you know, maybe biased in this situation, but the blame the sheriff's office received whenever they aren't to blame for a lot of it. The Osage County Sheriff's Office never received a phone call of the shooting or the murder or anything. I mean, wrap your mind around that. Never.
Right.
The dispatcher, at that point, they ran on 490, which was a sheriff's state of radio net, and you could hear a lot of agencies around. And the dispatcher heard the Washington County Sheriff's Office dispatching out a Bartlesville ambulance to the Mullendore Ranch for a shooting. The Osage County dispatcher heard this and called the deputy on duty that was out at the Redbud Diner, that's now Subway outside of Pawhuska, and called the deputy, and that was Bill Mitchell, and said, you know, hey, there's supposed to be a shooting or something at the Mullendore, so he was going to head up there. And whenever he heads up there, he passes the ambulance leaving the ranch. EC's body's already moved. You know, so if we're going to sit here and start pointing fingers, there's fingers to be pointed many other places. And I always kind of hated that for Sheriff Wayman because a lot of people blamed him and his agency for the lack of capability and all this stuff on that investigation.
I haven't read the current book, Footprints in the Dew, but I read the first book, and it starts out kind of making fun of George Wayman because he's parking cars at the funeral, you know, or helping,
right?
You know,
right.
kind of, and said, this is the biggest case in Osage County history, and you got the sheriff parking cars. You know, that's the way the book started out,
right?
As I remember it, something to that effect. So they caught a lot of heat right from the get-go over that.
You know, and just to sum that up some more, you know, the law enforcement in 1970 is totally different than it was now.
Cowboys of the Osage,